I'm Mark Morton, and my colleague, Kyle Schultz, and I have developed this screencast about gamification in order to deliver some of the content of a gamification workshop that we offer at the University of Waterloo. We decided that if we provide some of the workshop content through a screencast, then our participants will have more time during the actual workshop to think about how they can put gamification principles into practice in their own courses. So, first off, what is gamification? Essentially, it's the process of adding game elements to conventional activities in order to increase engagement and motivation. Now, I almost said conventional learning activities, but I didn't, because gamification didn't actually emerge in an educational context, but rather in a corporate context. Corporations, or at least the marketing departments of corporations, have long leveraged game elements in order to increase sales or awareness of their product. For example, in the 1930s, Ovaltine, the company that makes a malted beverage, gamified the act of buying their product by teaming up with the radio show Little Orphan Annie. Kids who collected and mailed in 3 Ovaltine labels would be sent a secret booklet that let them help Annie solve coded messages in the radio show. This kind of product gamification has been replicated every decade since then. And gamified products aren't just for children. Starbucks has gamified the act of buying coffee by creating Starbucks rewards. Every time you purchase a Starbucks product, you accumulate stars. Once you get a certain number of stars, you achieve level 1. More stars bring you to level 2, and even more to level 3. Each level offers different rewards, such as free refills, a bonus food item on your birthday, and special offers that are emailed to you. Canadian Tire, every so often, will give you a scratch card at the checkout counter. Scratch one of the circles, reveal the percentage that's underneath, and that's the amount of discount that you'll receive for your purchase. One more example. A few years ago, activity trackers such as Fitbit began to gamify exercise. You strap the Fitbit device to your wrist, and it will encourage you throughout the day by telling you when you've achieved milestones in your pursuit of reaching, say, 10,000 steps. Attain that goal for a certain number of days in a row, and the Fitbit will brag about you on Facebook. All of those are examples of gamification in a corporate context, but before we turn to the educational context, it's useful to distinguish gamification from something called game-based learning. Essentially, game-based learning is the process of incorporating game elements into the actual design of activities in order to increase engagement and motivation. In other words, the game elements aren't just added to a pre-existing activity. Rather, the activity is designed from the ground up to incorporate game elements. For example, in a business course, the conventional way of learning about product development, marketing, finance, and so on might be to simply read about it or to discuss some case studies. The game-based approach to learning the same material might be to create an online system in which students actually collaborate and compete with one another as they grow a virtual business. In other words, the learning activity is a game-based simulation of what actually happens in real life. At the University of Waterloo, some instructors in the School of Accounting and Finance use an online program called Mike's Bikes to engage in this kind of game-based learning. In a political science course, students might role-play as they engage in mock negotiations involving a labor dispute. So, just to summarize the difference between gamification and game-based learning, gamification is where you add game elements to pre-existing or conventional activities. Game-based learning is where you design a learning activity from the ground up in order to incorporate game elements. What are some common or essential elements or characteristics of all or most games? Here are some game elements that Kyle and I would propose. First, in terms of players, games can be solo, like solitaire, or pair-based, like backgammon, or group-based, like poker. In terms of the relationship between or among the players, games can be competitive, like chess, or collaborative, like in bridge, where partners collaborate in winning tricks. In terms of their design, most games involve rules and some sense of challenge for the players. They might also entail striving for certain kinds of achievement or status within the game, as in an online trivia game called Quiz Up. Most games are also low stakes. For example, when you play Monopoly, you're not losing or gaining actual money. You leave with your pants on and your wallet in your pocket. Most games are also based on rapid feedback cycles. For example, when you play Scrabble, you get feedback on your play in the form of a new score every time you create a new word. In terms of the skills that many or most games demand of the players, they include critical thinking in the form of strategies and problem solving, and creativity in the form of, say, storytelling or developing an avatar or persona. What do these various game elements result in as far as the student is concerned? Well, things like enjoyment, engagement, and motivation, all of which we associate with effective learning. Let's make this a bit more concrete now by considering what gamification and game-based learning might look like in practice. It might include points that students accumulate, either as they succeed in the game or simply by continuing to play it. It might include leaderboards, which can show a student's ranking relative to other students. For example, a leaderboard might indicate who the top 5 students are in a gamified learning activity. Or a leaderboard might show each student just the 2 students who are above him or her, and the 2 students who are below him or her. This can create a low-stakes sense of competition. Students might also be recognized as having attained specific achievements in an activity, and these achievements might be represented by various badges such as newbie, novice, sheriff, maven, expert, and so on. For example, in the online discussion forum for a course, students might achieve different badges depending on how many posts they contribute, how many times classmates upvote their posts, and so on. Games can also be designed to have different levels so that every player is playing at an appropriate level of challenge. After all, too easy and the students get bored, too hard and they might give up. In a course, this might involve giving students a diagnostic exercise so that the instructor can get each student to begin a gamified learning activity at the appropriate level. In a gamified learning activity, students might even receive material rewards, albeit low stakes or light-hearted ones. For example, an instructor might offer to buy a donut for the student who moves up the greatest number of rankings over the period of several weeks in an ongoing game based on learning new terminology. Of course, it goes without saying that gamified learning activities, just like all learning activities and all games, need to have clear objectives if they're going to be successful. Some gamified learning activities might be based upon the development of a story or narrative, or the exploration of a theme. For example, a course in the history of science might have students role-play either Thomas Edison or Nikola Tesla, and then have them reconstruct, step by step, the feud that those 2 inventors had about alternating current versus direct current. Good gamified learning activities should also provide feedback to the students. In other words, they should provide students with opportunities to assess how well they are doing and how they might further improve their performance. Duolingo, for example, is a gamified language learning app that shows a user how much progress he or she has made toward a learning goal, such as memorizing the names of 20 animals. All of these things are the elements or attributes that you might leverage when you gamify an existing learning activity or design a brand new game-based learning activity. Now, in lieu of an intermission, here's a quotation to ponder from Daryl Charles, an expert in gamification at the University of Ulster. The use of games in education is not about injecting fun that is missing from traditional learning processes, but rather it is about trying to enhance the fun that is inherent in most learning. Next, let's look at some tools that you can use to create gamified or game-based learning activities. First, you could use various kinds of classroom response systems, that is, tools that allow the instructor to easily and quickly ask questions and aggregate student responses. Clickers are one such tool, and they can either be physical, hardware-based devices, or they can be apps that students install on their smartphones. Quizzing platforms such as Kahoot are another such tool. Or you might use if-at cards, which are paper cards with 10 rows of 5 multiple-choice options, in other words, A to D. Students scratch an opaque film off of the cell that corresponds to their selected answer. If the cell reveals a star, the student knows that he or she got it correct. If not, then he or she can select from the remaining 4 cells. These if-at cards, as well as clickers or tools like Kahoot, can be used to create individual or team-based competitions. Other tools for gamified learning activities include mobile technologies and commercial games. For example, Duolingo, which I mentioned before, is an app for mobile devices that helps students learn another language. Duolingo has badges, points, and leaderboards built into it, as well as the ability to compete against other users. Minecraft is an online platform that allows users to build virtual worlds. Gamified learning activities in Minecraft include having students replicate a significant landscape, such as the Plains of Abraham in a Canadian history course, or a building such as the Original Globe Theatre for a Shakespeare course. Other massively multiplayer online role-playing games, such as World of Warcraft, can also be used to support similar types of learning activities and can also facilitate both competition and collaboration among players. Digital micro-credentialing is another tool you can use to support gamified learning activities. Essentially, digital micro-credentialing via platforms such as Credly or Open Badges is a way of formally acknowledging when a student achieves certain competencies or milestones. For example, at Purdue University, students in an introductory chemistry course receive a digital credential or badge when they demonstrate that they have learned how to safely and correctly use certain kinds of lab equipment. The badges are added to each student's e-portfolio. Pocket Points is worth mentioning, if only because of its unique purpose. Students install the Pocket Points app on their smartphones, which monitors their use of that device. If students manage to not use their smartphone during class, they earn a few Pocket Points. Over time, if they accumulate enough points, they are rewarded with something like a free pizza from a local business that is participating in the Pocket Points program. Let's conclude by considering some best practices for implementing gamification or game-based learning in your courses. First, you should gamify learning activities rather than trying to gamify your course content. Let's say, for example, that you want your students to understand the causes of the First World War. You might do so by delivering a lecture, and then you might try to gamify that lecture content by telling students to write down as many causes as they can remember. And the student who remembers the most causes will be declared the winner. That approach is not really leveraging the principles of gamification. Nothing has really changed about how the students interact with the course content. On the other hand, you might get them to learn about the causes of the First World War by delivering a much shorter lecture and then having students form small groups. You could then assign a different cause of the war to each group, and each group would have 15 minutes to further research that cause using online resources. Each group would then be given an additional 10 minutes to put together a brief presentation in which they argue that their cause is the most crucial. After each group makes its presentation, all of the students vote on the best presentation by clapping. How many thought presentation A was most convincing, how many thought presentation B, etc. The loudness of the clapping determines the winner. This way of choosing the winner is, of course, a bit arbitrary, but it doesn't really matter because the stakes are low and the students will have enjoyed the gamified learning activity, whether their group wins or not. Next, gamified learning activities should be low stakes and should have rapid feedback cycles. In the example I just gave about having groups of students compete in presenting the causes of the First World War, the stakes are very low. There's no grades associated with that gamified learning activity as I described it. What would happen if the stakes had been higher? For example, if the ranking of the small groups had a significant impact on student grades. For one thing, the students would be more anxious, and it's hard for someone to learn when they're anxious. As well, the dynamics within the group would change. The quote-unquote better students would likely do more of the research and presenting, and the weaker students in each group would recede into the background. The dynamics between the groups would also change. There might be less of a sense of let's all do our best and more of a sense of we've got to be the best. And maybe most importantly, the fun that propelled the original gamified learning activity would diminish or disappear. As for rapid feedback, it's important in a gamified learning activity, just as it is in any learning activity. It provides the learners with data about how well they are doing and how they can improve. Let's use a clicker-based activity as an example. Let's say you have 5 questions that you want to ask your students in class. You project the first question with 5 multiple-choice answers onto the classroom screen, and then you give your students 3 minutes to come up with their answer individually. They then use their clickers to select one of the multiple-choice responses, and you reveal a bar chart of their responses without yet telling them the correct answer. You then have them discuss the same question in small groups, and you then ask them to again use their clickers to respond to the question, and again share the new bar chart of responses with them. Usually, peer instruction results in more students getting the correct answer. You then, as the instructor, run through the process of determining the right answer before moving on to the next question. This kind of gamified learning activity provides much more formative feedback than if you just had the students complete a written quiz which you graded and returned a few days later. Another best practice for creating gamified learning activities is to build in goals, levels, or achievements. These function as milestones so that students can have a personal or internal sense of their ongoing progress. The external or public version of these milestones can take the form of another best practice, namely badges, titles, and other forms of recognition that are evident to a student's classmates. For example, if your course makes use of an online discussion group, you could award a badge, let's say it's called Deputy, to any student who contributes 15 thoughtful posts to the group. A student who contributes 25 such postings earns the Sheriff badge. One who contributes 50 posts gets the Marshal badge, and so on. Though such badges might seem trivial, numerous studies conducted over the past 15 years have affirmed the efficacy of points and badges in motivating increased engagement. Rewarding students' success and effort is also a best practice for gamified learning activities. Rewarding effort is important because it helps to keep the learning activity low stakes. As I noted previously, if students become too focused on their performance, their resulting anxiety can hinder their learning. Rewarding effort is essentially a way of encouraging time on task, which in the long term, at least, leads to more learning. A final best practice is, of course, to accommodate students who might be uncomfortable participating in gamified learning activities. Some of the elements that make gamification effective for many students, such as competition or status or recognition, can make it ineffective for others. Providing such students with alternative learning activities or with less stressful or less public ways of participating in gamified learning activities can help to alleviate their unease. That's the end of our screencast, and we hope that the content has been a useful introduction to gamification and game-based learning.